Here's the tea. It's hot, it's boiling, and I'm gonna splash it in your face. Welcome back to Not For Lack of Trying. My friend made me this adorable mug to celebrate the channel. It's to sip the tears of my enemies. Now, unfortunately, I did watch Pocahontas 2 in preparation for this video, and it was just as terrible as I thought it would be. And I forgot to get my screen grabs the first time around, which means I got to watch this movie twice. But this cursed afternoon did offer me a gift. In watching it 2 times, a revelation in who the true big bad of these movies is. It's not Governor Ratliff. It isn't John Smith. It isn't John Ralph. It's not even Thomas. Yes, they are all terrible. Everyone is terrible. But the worst of the worst is Mrs. Jenkins, Ralph's unassuming housemaid. But I will dive deeper into that later. First, I'd like to say that me calling these things Indian isn't a slip up or an insensitivity. My grandmother was Lakota, a subsect of Sioux, and members of my family practically insist that calling things Indian is appropriate because it draws attention to the outdated legislational language. Now, I can't speak for any group of people. I can't speak for anyone else. I can only speak for myself, but I did do weeks worth of research in order to prepare for this video, and I'm trying to be as accurate and as sensitive as possible. So today we're going to talk about Pocahontas 1 and 2. So Pocahontas 1 and 2 are very different tones. In Pocahontas 1, she's sort of the embodiment of the good Indian and the Western desire. Whereas in Pocahontas 2, she's sort of the hopeful assimilation of the Indians into English sophistication and submission. Now, instead of going through both movies beat by beat, because that would be a tedious slog, I've broken things down into categories. So 1, her clothing or the clothing of the tribe. Number 2, her hair. Number 3, the music. Number 4, her village. Number 5, the treatment of Indians. Number 6, tattoos / her skin tone. And number 7, who the real villain of the movie is. And then at the end, talking about the real Pocahontas and who she was. And like as a sneaky added bonus, we're going to look at some jacked up Pocahontas toys because they are really bad. Number 1, the outfit / the clothing of the tribe. She wears a skin tight hugging dress with, some fringe at the bottom. And I don't really have as much of an issue with the one shoulder. There is very little reference material from that time to indicate the different styles of clothing that women wore in the Powhatan tribe at the time. But current Powhatans have stated that it wouldn't be uncommon for women to wear 1 or a 2-shoulder dress if it were colder out. Current folks representing the tribe in the recreated Powhatan Village in Virginia, and they wear their tribal garments for educational purposes. Several women are shown seeing the 1-shoulder tops. I think more of the issue with her clothing isn't necessarily the 1 shoulder, it's the structured sweetheart neckline that so specifically follows her curvy, very womanly nature. But considering that she's like 11 or 12 at the time, I think that's why people have more of the issue, because that's why I have an issue. From what we do know historically, Powhatans didn't wear much clothing when around camp. Early settlers even document how the Powhatans were acclimated to extreme weather conditions, even breaking through the ice from the rivers to make sure they still bathed every single day. I don't know about y'all, but if the water isn't warm enough in my shower to turn my tummy pink, I'm not getting in. It was very common to see the frontal apron worn, but we know that the Powhatan also wore more layers or moccasins when they were out in the forest to gather or hunt. The few surviving documentations that we see show Powhatans wearing similar clothing to this, and it looks marginally similar to our girl Pocahontas's clothing. So overall, it is somewhat historically accurate. I'm also really thrilled that the chief isn't seen wearing one of those giant Plains Indians headdresses, because it was certainly not known for the tribes of that region to wear, but it's usually Hollywood's go-to for an Indian accessory. The chief's cloak wouldn't have been plain buckskin. We actually have in a museum currently some examples of what Chief Powhatan's cloak would have looked like. It was pretty common for Powhatans of that area to wear furs of the red wolf, the red and gray foxes. They also wore mantles made of turkey feathers. Women of that region were absolute experts at weaving turkey and duck feathers. Even John Smith and John Ralph commented in their writings how impressive the women of that region's skill was in weaving feather garments. Their clothes also would have had a lot more texture, interest, color, beadwork than we currently see right now. Now, they wear the same tan buckskin clothing that kind of blends together, and there's maybe like three renditions of the same outfit just on different people, which is a shame because the English characters in the background that we see do get much more varying clothing and colors and shapes and styles. So it's kind of a missed opportunity for the Powhatans to get an exciting wardrobe. The Powhatan wore all kinds of shells and fangs and beads, talons, porcupine quills, and bone, including rattlesnake vertebrae, which is so cool. They also would have worn some copper, but it would have been on people of a higher tribal status. But I get that the animation in the 90s rendering all those feathers and shells and ornamentation in their outfits would have like exploded the computers at the time. So there's a scene in Pocahontas 2 where she enters the room that John Rolfe is in wearing English undergarments, which is more clothing than what we've seen her in previously. And Ralph and his maid get like all flushed, like, oh no, she's in her underwear. And like Mrs. Jenkins dubiously puts Pocahontas in these undergarments and like loses track of her. Was this an accident? Or was this an attempt to humiliate our girl? Because, like, look at this look. She looks so sneaky. She did it on purpose. But luckily for us, Pocahontas eats shame and ridicule for breakfast. Also, in preparation for the king's ball, Mrs. Jenkins puts Pocahontas like forcefully in a corset. We know historically that corsets were not meant to injure or hurt people, yet Mrs. Jenkins still goes for the death blow, like squeezing all the air out of Pocahontas's lungs. Then, to attend the king's ball, Pocahontas takes off her necklace, rejecting the last piece of her heritage, and puts on the gold necklace. Gold, the thing that colonists were destroying her homeland for. And in my opinion, this is like the darkest part of the movie, where she has traded every single piece of herself in order to gain favor with a king who will ultimately give the order to slaughter all of her people. And then Mrs. Jenkins puts Pocahontas in this as her court gown. This gown would have been wildly inappropriate for the time. A fully off-the-shoulder look would not have been worn. Also, the understructure would have been way more about accentuating the hips out to the side versus the full circle skirt that we see. So historically speaking, this would have happened just after the death of Queen Elizabeth I. So the English queen at the time, Queen Anne of Denmark, would have been the natural trendsetter for the ladies at court. And you can see in the two scenes that she is wearing, large sleeves, a wide collar, still emulating the fashions that were made popular by Queen Elizabeth. So Pocahontas, bearing as much skin as possible on top, the thing that all the English gawked at her before, Mrs. Jenkins once again puts Pocahontas on the back foot by not having her wear something that's appropriate for court. There would not have been such a wide opening showing the underskirt part. We know that white is symbolic for something, her purity from her savage ways. Ugh. Number 2, her hair. Powhatan, as well as many Native American cultures, have very strong beliefs around hair. They believe that it's tied to earth and nature, and the long hair is somewhat symbolic of tying yourself to Mother Earth, whose hair is long grasses. It is believed in a lot of Indian culture that there's a physical manifestation of growth of the spirit in your hair, and some say that it has extra sensory perception, and it's your connection to all living things. So with Indian tradition in that region, braided hair signifies unity with the infinite and with your tribe, and allowing hair to flow freely signifies the free flow of life. I don't think Nakoma with her short blunted bangs would have been a style for Powhatan women in those days. It's very much a trend of the 1990s. And we see that she has somewhat short hair, even though it's tied up into a bun. So we know that sometime down the line, Nakoma may have experienced a loss or a specific change in a chapter of her life because her hair isn't as long as Pocahontas's. But back to Pocahontas, in the first movie, her hair is flowing free for most of the movie. But there is one moment where her hair isn't, and it's when Miko is braiding her hair and she's talking about the conflict of her path and whether or not to choose what's best for the tribe or to follow her heart. And her hair is braided, symbolizing unity and her unity with the tribe. In Pocahontas 2, her hair is flowing free until she gets to England, in which she's put into various English updos, symbolizing her assimilation. And when she's finally free of her English captors, her hair flies free again. So there is a song where Mrs. Jenkins says, "John loves a girl with curls," which is so gross, but it kind of means more than that. Mrs. Jenkins, who in an effort to colonize Pocahontas, takes her free-spirited hair and ties it into these absurd hairstyles and finally into this outrageous updo with curls, and would only lead to her being judged by those attending court. Mrs. Jenkins wants Pocahontas to fail. Another insult to Pocahontas's hair is in another scene where like the nearly blind Mrs. Jenkins confuses a horse's tail with Pocahontas's hair, and like this is played for a goof, but we know that Mrs. Jenkins sees Pocahontas as an animal, a horse, something beautiful that can be domesticated. Number 3, the music. Such a bummer because the opening of the first movie, which is this European snare drum, like have the writers never heard of powwow music? Because that music slaps. Absolutely should have been more part of the original soundtrack. I'll just let the music speak for itself in making a musical number where the settlers call the Indians barely even human. The words savages, savages, dirty shrieking devils. Maybe we'll kill an Injun, or maybe 2 or 3. That's bold. But the only settler that's overtly the bad guy is the Governor Ratcliffe character. So when all the settlers sing this song and he's the only one punished, and he's only punished because he shot John, the other guys don't apologize or anything, doesn't really make up for it. The rest of the squad just kind of leave off to England and all is somehow forgiven. In the sequel, there's a powwow, but it's really not that long. It should be a lot longer. And most of the powwow scene is relegated to Miko causing a ruckus around camp. Then Pocahontas sings a song about how London is everything she ever dreamed and how there's people of all shapes and sizes, further exemplifying how homogenized the Indian culture is and how England is this inclusive place where all are existing joyously. Number 4, the setting / her village. The Powhatan people lived in structures called yehakans, and they do look pretty similar in the movie to the ones that we do know existed. They're, the smaller dome-shaped buildings or longer ones to fit more people, depending on how big your family was or what the purpose of that building was. There wouldn't have been just this large corn patch and then a green bean patch. This is a very Western English version of farming and is pretty inaccurate to what the tribe would have done at the time. In the first movie, we do see totem poles for like all of 2 seconds. But in the sequel, there are totem poles during the powwow scene around the fire, and we can see a powwow for like a full 20 seconds, which is really, really exciting. So the word powwow is an Algonquin word for powwow, which would have been a curing dance done by a shaman. But we know now that powwow is sort of this like pan-Indian word for a social or public festival, but I'm really glad that they included it, where it was clearly missing in the first one. The Powhatan totem poles do look like this. They look pretty accurate with the face at the top directed inward to the circle, but it's likely that 4 of them at least would have been painted by the 4 cardinal directions. So red meaning the east, where the universe began, black meaning the west, where the sun sets, white being the cold north, representing, the color of death, and then yellow, which is the south, which represents the origin of the warm winds. I think the totem pole scene was pulled specifically from a drawing that, one of the Johns did, where it has 7 totem poles, but it is likely that there would have been 8 actual totem poles. And I don't know why one of them would have been missing at this time, but it's pretty funny how Disney obviously did this based on a drawing that one of the Johns did at the time, even though the drawing itself is likely inaccurate. Number 5, the treatment of the Indians. Thomas shot Kocoum, and Thomas sees zero justice. Governor Ratcliffe shoots John, the white man, and gets arrested. John Smith is literally quoted as seeing hundreds of New World, and if they're anything like the savages I've encountered before, it's nothing I can't handle. He literally says that, which makes John Smith definitely a bad guy. Then we have John Ralph, who brings Pocahontas to England and basically treats her like a spectacle.
What?
And chastises her for running around, being free-spirited, climbing trees, not acting like a proper lady. He just sets her up to fail, like so many other people. Another point is Ute isn't allowed to go to the king's ball because he doesn't have a jacket, but once he like steals someone else's, all the ladies at court are like so thirsty for him.
Because I'm going to climb that like a tree.
So Ute is her tribal protector, and he kind of elects to run beside the carriage rather than ride inside. And it's absolutely hilarious because you just see him like trot beside like Tom Haverford in Parks and Rec. And I thought this would just be the case at the beginning, but it literally happens like 3 other times throughout the movie. There's a moment where Governor Ratcliffe says, hopefully they don't see the real you, when Pocahontas is dressed for court in her English finery, meaning that her true savage nature is hidden underneath her clothes. Also, there's a moment where Pocahontas tries to talk to the king, but she's dismissed over and over again for being an Indian and a woman. Despite the movie having her spoken status as being a princess to them, She's still dismissed over and over. In court, Ratliff tries to convince the king that Pocahontas is a savage because she cares for animals. You know, they bait this bear that they have chained up, and because she doesn't want to see it openly tortured in court, this is enough to make her a traitor to the crown for some reason. Another point is that the chief, who is not given nearly as much screen time as I think he should be, or the respect that he truly deserved, his name is actually this. I'm not going to try to say it and butcher it, but you think a man covered in all these tattoos is just going to sit back and let some colonist fools run amok? No. Chief Powhatan headed a 34 Indian Nations alliance at the time. He was Memenotowik, the chief of chiefs. It's estimated that his influence covered as much as 10,000 square miles and roughly 30 tribes, maybe as many as 34 tribes, still kind of undecided. It's possible that his influence was over 15,000 people in the Chesapeake Bay region. Number 6, I think. I've lost track of numbers. Anyways, number 6, tattoos / skin tone that's represented in the movie. Speaking of Chief Powhatan, there are some red lines sort of seen on him, and also a red ink tattoo on Pocahontas's arm. But none of the actual tattoos that were on Chief Powhatan are seen in the Chief Powhatan in the movie. It was pretty common for Powhatan women to have lots of tattoos, even on their faces. Women of the tribe would have been more tattooed than the men, and the men would have been painted more specifically during warfare. And we do see that men painting up, getting ready for war. So that part is accurate. The more common colors for warfare would have been red or black. There's a moment where the chief calls white people white or pale face, and Pocahontas refers to herself as having copper skin. But natives at the time didn't refer to themselves as red-skinned or copper-skinned. This was actually something made more popular by Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, and it was like his anthropology study of human skulls and the categorization of like the 5 human races. So there was white, black, yellow, brown, and red. And this is not something that would have normally been said at the time. It would have been pretty controversial. And we have to give him credit, as he was one of the very few people that concluded through craniotomy that the races were not, in fact, inferior to each other, and all were capable of scientific thought and poetry. In the second movie, Pocahontas is seen for several scenes wearing lightning powder on her face, on her neck, and by her shoulders by the freaking Mrs. Jenkins. Something to note, it's after she wears the lightning powder and Ralph sees her that he calls her beautiful. This isn't necessarily a skin tone thing, but I'm actually really happy that they portrayed the Powhatans as really tall in the movie. I don't know if this was necessarily accidental, but the chief, Pocahontas, and her travel companion Ute are shown as really, really tall. And Ute is so tall that it's almost like a comedic effect. This would have absolutely been the case. There was lots of documentation from early settlers that the Native Americans were exceptionally tall, and several being as tall as 6'6". There's an early description of Chief Powhatan as a, quote, tall, well-proportioned man with a sour look. His age neareth 60, a very able and hard body to endure any labor. But Mrs. Jenkins is afraid of the Indians, and she, who has failed in her secret mission to assimilate Pocahontas, sets her sights on Ute. Her very first glance with him, she is very obviously afraid, but what a better way to control your fear than to use the minimal power a woman of her station at that time would have had and control the thing that she fears. At first, Ute rejects her, opting only to put on a bright turquoise war paint for court. But now that she has her sights on him, she will not relent in her conquest. And we'll talk about that later. Next, the real Pocahontas and the Powhatan initial perception of the film. Right after the movie's release, the Powhatan Nation came forth and said it distorts reality beyond recognition. But Disney came back and in answer to the Powhatan complaint said, the film is, quote, responsible, accurate, and respectful. The story of Pocahontas is summed up in this really nice quote by Jackie Mansky, and it's that the idea that this is a good Indian, she admires the white man, admires Christianity, admires the culture, and wants to have peace with these people, and is willing to live with these people rather than her own, marry him rather than her own. The whole idea makes people in white America culture feel good about our history. It's not that we're doing anything wrong to the Indians, but we're really helping them, and the good ones appreciated it. Now, Disney doesn't go about it that strong at the top of the story. She is skeptical of John Smith at first. She does call him out on his ideas about her people. She doesn't let him gaslight her when he calls her savages and then tries to convince her that it's not that bad of a word. Unfortunately, the true story of Pocahontas has a really sad ending. In 1612, at the age of 17, Pocahontas was taken prisoner by the English while on a social visit and was held hostage in Jamestown for over a year. During her captivity, the 28-year-old John Ralph took a special interest in the attractive young prisoner. So, in the first movie, where she chooses to stay with her people, but in reality, her freedom was conditional to the marriage of John Ralph. So, either she's a prisoner in a cell or she's a prisoner in marriage. What a choice! So, in April 1614, Matawaka, also known as Pocahontas, the daughter of Chief Powhatan, is renamed Rebecca Rolfe. And shortly after, they did have children, and all the descendants of Pocahontas and John Ralph are known as the Red Ralphs. 2 years later, in the spring of 1616, Ralph took her to England, where the Virginia Company of London used her as a propaganda machine to support the colonies. And she was wined and dined and taken to theaters, and it was recorded that on one occasion, she encountered John Smith again. How about that? But when she encountered John Smith, she straight up called him a liar and showed him the door. Yeah, girl. After the Virginia Company of London was done with Pocahontas and their propaganda tour, she and Ralph went back to Virginia, but unfortunately, Rebecca had to be taken off the ship because she was ill and then died at the age of 21. She was buried at a place called Gravesend, but eventually her grave was destroyed for a reconstruction of the church. It was only after her death and sort of fame in London society that John Smith found it convenient to invent the story that she had rescued him. John Smith told this story about like 17 years after it happened, and this was one of 3 different instances where John was claimed to be saved by some beautiful, prominent woman. He Gilderoy Lockharted this poor girl. Then in 1618, the settlers turned on the Powhatans, and Chief Powhatan died that spring. During Pocahontas' generation, the Powhatan people were decimated and dispersed, and their lands ultimately taken over. So that brings us to number 7, maybe 8, I don't remember, doesn't matter, to the true villain of the movie. Don't look at me, neighbor. The villain of the movie is very similar to the villain of the real world, and that is the seemingly well-intentioned people trying to teach Indians how to be a part of their culture. Mrs. Jenkins is the big bad of the movie. Don't believe me? Let me recap my point. Mrs. Jenkins lightens Pocahontas' skin, puts her in inappropriate clothing and hair for court. She forces the relationship between Rolfe and our girl. She locks down the free-spirited hair. She confuses her with an animal. She assimilates Ute and subdues the symbol of the free warrior. And in one of the final scenes, Mrs. Jenkins' evil plan has finally come to fruition. She has successfully subdued the bear. This, as we know from the first movie, is the symbol of tribal strength, as Cocoam was painted with the bear paws on his chest when he defeated the Massawomics in battle. So, Mrs. Jenkins has domesticated the symbol of Indian freedom, spirit, and fight as she leads it away on a rope, followed by the actual prisoner himself, Ute. Mrs. Jenkins walks away with the bear from earlier on a leash, and Ute, dressed in ridiculous London finery. You may notice that his hair is cut, something only done in Indian culture when a great loss has been suffered or it has been forcibly put upon them. Mrs. Jenkins is the poster child for forced assimilation of Indians into the US, being forced to reject their own clothing, cut their hair, forbidden to speak their own language, and pulled from their homeland or tribe. I'm honestly surprised she didn't just openly call him Michael and drop him off at Catholic school. Ooh, it's a little heavy. So we're going to end on a light note. And we're going to talk about the Pocahontas merch and toys that are so rough. So, since the movie's release, there have been many attempts to give Pocahontas an updated look, but each time it becomes apparent that it is less about historical accuracy and more about conveying a more like blanket tribal look, and they are so funny. This is a thing that you can spend your hard-earned money on. It is so stupid expensive. It's inaccurate to the time. That sort of collar wouldn't have been a thing. It wouldn't have been made out of metal. It just simply wouldn't be a thing. If that doesn't satisfy you, they have lots of action figures, like Thomas, where you too can shoot Indians and pan for gold that isn't there. My absolute favorite is the Sun Colors doll that had me just laugh so hard. Apparently, the doll was printed with her face having like hypertelorism, and Nakoma basically looks like a casting reject from the intro of Pretty Woman. It's just floss. And I've got Buddy right here. He's gonna help me with my video. Ignore the mess.